I saw the boss hand my wife a ring during the company dinner. The hall was lit with elegant lights, glasses clinked in mock toasts, and conversations filled with empty praise filled the air. But none of that mattered. My eyes were glued to the scene unfolding before me. He held her hand, his fingers gliding gently over the skin that, as far as I knew, was mine. The black box opened between the two, revealing a ring that shouldn't be there. My chest burned. My blood boiled in a second. The air seemed to escape my lungs as my brain tried to understand what that meant. What was I seeing? My mind refused to process, but my eyes didn't blink. Every detail of that scene was stuck in my mind. Her smile. The way she looked at him, as if they were the only ones in the room. The way his lips moved, murmuring something I couldn't hear. The way he held her hand, sliding the ring onto her finger with an intimacy that tore me up inside. A shiver ran down my spine. My heart was beating so hard that I could feel the pulse in my throat. The feeling of betrayal exploded inside me, a direct blow to my confidence, my dignity, my sanity. I got up from the table. I didn't care about the looks that were directed at me. The ambient music seemed to have disappeared. Conversations had turned into a distant hum. There were only the two of them there, and me. I walked steadily, each step echoing like a hammer hitting hot iron. When I got close, they both looked up at me at the same time. There was surprise in her expression. Guilty. But not from those who regret it. Whoever was caught in the act. He, on the other hand, maintained that superior posture, as if none of that was a problem. As if he knew he could do that and get away with it. I trusted you, I spoke quietly, but my voice carried a crushing weight. Her face paled. That was the face of the woman who, every night, slept next to me. Who held my hand in difficult times. Who told me he loved me. And now, before me, she had another ring on her finger. A ring that I didn't put on. She opened her mouth, but before she said anything, my voice sounded even stronger. Now your whole family will discover who you really are. The hall seemed to freeze. A few pairs of eyes turned to us. But I didn't care. I wanted to see the panic in her eyes. I wanted to see the boss get a taste of his own arrogance. I wanted her to understand that there was no going back. She tried to grab my arm, her fragile fingers clinging to me as if she could somehow stop me. But that only disgusted me even more. How did she have the courage? How did you manage to sit at the table with me every night while giving yourself to him? How did she sleep next to me while allowing another man to touch her? How did you lie so blatantly, repeatedly, looking me in the eye? The boss, on the other hand, straightened his tie and took a deep breath, as if he was about to say something rehearsed. As if he had the audacity to try to justify the unjustifiable. That man, who I respected, who I admired, who always showed integrity and professionalism, now stood before me like a scoundrel, a traitor who took advantage of the power he had to infiltrate my home, my marriage, my world. You're overreacting, he said, his voice carrying a calm that made me want to break something. My wife let out a shaky breath. But there were no tears in her eyes. There was no true repentance. There was fear, yes. But afraid of being exposed. Betrayal is a knife that cuts deep. It's not just the pain of losing someone. It's humiliation. It's the breaking of everything that was built. It's knowing that someone who swore to love you consciously chose to deceive you. Who lied while hugging you. Who smiled at you while stabbing you in the back. And now, all I wanted was for the truth to come out. Let everyone know. Her family. The friends. The entire company. The boss's wife. Did he think he could do this and get away with it? Did you think I would just accept it? A betrayed man's mind works differently. In the beginning, there is pain. The shock. The despair. But then comes the fury. The need for revenge. The desire to do justice. To expose. To show the world who the real traitors are. And if there's anything I learned in that moment, it was that this betrayal would not go unpunished. The remaining question was, how far would I be willing to go to make sure they paid? Welcome to the channel where betrayal will never be romanticized, but rather exposed in its most cruel and destructive form. Here, the stories are fictional, but the lessons are real. Infidelity destroys lives, erodes trust and leaves marks that never fade. Each narrative is a reminder that every action has consequences. Now, get ready to dive into an intense story, full of twists and painful truths. Take a deep breath, because what comes next will surprise you. Night fell gently over the city, enveloping everything in a golden aura reflected by the lights that began to come on in the buildings and the busy streets that never seemed to rest. The restaurant chosen for the company's event was one of the most sophisticated in the region, with chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling, glass walls that reflected the shine of the glasses and ambient music that mixed muffled conversations and polite laughter. Among the guests, seated at the central table, were Daniel and Isabel, a couple who, at first glance, seemed to have it all. Well-rehearsed smiles, looks that exchanged complicity with others, hands that occasionally touched as if nothing in the world could break that harmony. But the truth was more complex, denser, full of layers invisible to the naked eye. Daniel had always been a methodical man. From a young age, he had learned that effort and discipline were the only sure path to stability. Raised by strict parents, he grew up knowing that failure was not an option, that feelings were secondary to responsibilities. He carried with him a firm posture, an observant look that captured details that others ignored and a restrained behavior, without excesses of emotion, without outbursts of anger or euphoria. At work, he was respected. A reliable, loyal man, someone who didn't make enemies or create unnecessary friction. At home, she tried to maintain the same balance, although she often felt that her life was limited to following an invisible manual of what a good husband should be. He believed he loved Isabel. The security he felt having her by his side was proof of that, wasn't it? After all, that's what love was: stability, complicity, mutual trust. At least, that's what he always believed. Isabel, on the other hand, had always had a restless soul. Unlike Daniel, his childhood was not guided by strict rules, but rather by a freedom that, at times, was confused with negligence. Raised amidst constant changes, she learned early on to adapt to situations, to become what others expected of her. At the beginning of their marriage, she was enchanted by the security that Daniel offered her. He was predictable, constant, a safe haven in the midst of the chaos that had always been his life. But as the years passed, this predictability began to suffocate her. Each day was the same as the previous one, every gesture, every conversation, every look. Did you love Daniel? Yes, she told herself yes. He was a good, dedicated man, someone who always put her first. But inside her, something screamed. Something she tried to silence, but which, in recent months, had become increasingly difficult to ignore. The night passed with conversations about future projects, praise for the team's performance and toasts to the company's growth. Daniel, as always, was discreet, keeping an eye on his surroundings, absorbing the details. Isabel, in turn, radiated charisma. She knew exactly how to carry herself, how to make everyone around her feel comfortable, how to deflect personal questions gracefully and steer the conversation where she wanted. The boss, sitting next to her, looked enchanted. Leonard, he was a powerful man, one of those who dominated any environment without having to raise his voice. With an impeccable track record in the company and natural charisma, he knew how to win people over effortlessly. Isabel noticed the looks he threw her way, the way his attention lingered on her longer than he should have. Small gestures, subtle touches, phrases loaded with meaning that only the two of them seemed to understand. Daniel noticed. Of course I noticed. He wasn't naive. The instinct of observation that had always accompanied him captured every detail. The way Isabel laughed a little louder when Leonard said something, how she slightly tilted her body towards him, how her eyes sparkled in a different way. But Daniel was not an impulsive man. He didn't make scandals, he didn't allow himself to feel irrational jealousy. Isabel had always been sociable, she had always attracted attention, and he never bothered about it. But something that night felt different. An uncomfortable intuition, a silent discomfort growing inside him, like a piece out of place, a mistake in the perfect order of things. Dinner followed, the toasts were repeated, the sophisticated dishes were served to perfection. But for Daniel, every minute that passed seemed to drag by more slowly. He tried to push away the uncomfortable thoughts, to convince himself that it was just an ordinary night, that it was all just a mistaken impression. But when Leonard stood up and called Isabel to accompany him to one of the restaurant's private spaces, his chest tightened in a wave of warning. She hesitated for a moment, looked at Daniel, as if expecting something. But he said nothing. He just watched her get up, adjust her dress and follow Leonard, the two of them disappearing between the velvet curtains that separated the private space from the rest of the room. The next few minutes were long. Daniel looked around but saw nothing. Sounds became muffled, voices distant. All that filled his mind was the silence of the place where Isabel and Leonard were. He thought about getting up, about going after him, but he stopped himself. It wouldn't be irrational. He wouldn't be the jealous man who suspects without proof. He held the glass of wine between his fingers, feeling the icy surface against his warm skin. When he finally saw them returning, something inside him snapped. It wasn't the way Leonard smiled. It wasn't the lightness in Isabel's step. It was the detail. The small but fatal detail. The alliance. It glowed on his finger in a way it hadn't before. It wasn't the reflection of light, it wasn't a jewel that was already there. It was something new. Something that shouldn't be there. And in that instant, Daniel knew something was terribly wrong. The clock in the room said just over 10 at night when Isabel and Leonard returned to the table, as if nothing had happened. Daniel remained still, holding the glass between his fingers, feeling the smooth texture of the glass against his skin, trying to ignore the storm brewing inside him. The ring that now glittered on Isabel's finger shouldn't have been there. Something was wrong, he knew. But what had really happened in that short absence? He observed the details, the restrained gestures, the way she slightly lowered her gaze when she met his. The way Leonard maintained the same confident smile, as if he were in control of everything, as if nothing could shake him. Isabel placed her hand in her lap, perhaps without realizing that this gesture betrayed the newly acquired jewelry, as if she were trying to hide it. But it was too late. Daniel had already seen it. And I wouldn't forget. Dinner continued as if nothing had changed. Conversations about projects, misplaced laughter, toasts that sounded empty. Daniel felt her presence next to him, but he could no longer see her like he used to. A shadow hovered between them. The cold touch of silence weighed more than any word spoken. His mind worked quickly, searching for meaning in what he had seen. He could ask right then and there, he could demand an explanation, but something was stopping him. It wasn't the time. Not in front of so many people. He needed to understand first. I needed to be sure. Guests were beginning to disperse. Some were heading to the restaurant bar, others were already calling drivers to leave. Isabel stood up naturally, straightened her dress, as she always did, and smiled at Daniel, as if the night had been perfect. She asked if he wanted to stay a little longer or would he prefer to go home. He nodded slowly. I wanted to go home, yes. I wanted to be in a place where I could think, where I could confront her, where I could finally ask what I needed. The way back was silent. The car glided along the illuminated streets, reflecting distorted lights on the windshield. Isabel kept her eyes on the window, her fingers subtly sliding over the ring, as if she felt the weight of the object on her skin. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't take his eyes off the road, his hands were firmly on the steering wheel, his thoughts were in disarray. The silence between them wasn't unusual, but this time it was charged. He could feel the tension in the air, the unsaid hanging between the two. Ask now. Wait until you get home. He didn't know. There was a lump in my throat, something I couldn't swallow. When they entered the house, Isabel took off her shoes and went straight to her room, as she did every night. Daniel followed her steps slowly, watching every movement. The zipper of her dress sliding down her back, the perfume mixed with the smell of the room, the way she tied her hair before sitting at the dressing table. He leaned against the door, crossed his arms, took a deep breath. He asked about the alliance. Simple, direct. No apparent emotion. But she hesitated. And that small gap between the question and the answer was enough for Daniel to know something was wrong. Isabel looked up, her expression wavering between surprise and caution. He said it was a gift. A simple gift from Leonard. Something symbolic, unimportant. But his voice didn't sound steady. There was something about the way her hands slid over the object, a nervousness that she tried to hide. Daniel didn't respond. He just stared at her, waiting for more. Waiting for her to say something that would make him believe. But there was no more room for belief. He realized that he was no longer dealing with an assumption, with a passing discomfort. I was facing something real. Something that had been happening before his eyes, disguised by routine, by blind trust. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. Isabel fell asleep, or at least pretended to. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the emptiness growing inside him. He replayed every moment in the last few months, the small changes, the averted glances, the nights when she took a while to come back. Everything now made sense. Everything now fit together like pieces of a cruel puzzle. He knew he needed to find out more. I needed proof. He needed to see it with his own eyes. The next morning, his decision was already made. He wouldn't confront Isabel yet. He would wait. I would observe. He would follow her every step until he was absolutely sure of what he already suspected. The days that followed were a silent game. He maintained his facade, his discreet smile, his usual gestures. But inside him, something was breaking every moment. And then, he saw it. He followed Isabel one night, claiming he had extra work but in fact following her from afar. His heart was beating wildly in his chest when he saw her enter a hotel. Small, discreet, the kind of place that didn't attract attention. Waited. Minutes that felt like hours. And then, Leonard appeared. The world around Daniel collapsed. He didn't feel angry at first. Just an immense void, a bitter realization. He no longer needed answers. The truth was before him. Indisputable. Now, he knew. And that changed everything. The rain fell thinly that night, soaking the asphalt and reflecting the lights from the streetlights and the headlights of the cars that rushed by. Daniel was there, standing in front of the hotel, looking at the entrance as if time had slowed down. The impact of the betrayal still pulsed within him, but it was the need for revenge, the need for justice, that now burned brighter. He wouldn't back down. Not this time. His heart was beating heavily in his chest, his hands were clenched into fists, and his mind was filled with a single thought, to end this farce once and for all. Waited. You didn't have to wait long. Minutes later, the hotel door opened and Isabel came out. Her hair was still a little disheveled, her lips marked by lipstick that was beginning to lose color, and that lost look, as if she carried a secret that was eating her up inside. Behind her, Leonard appeared, adjusting his tie, with that confident expression of someone who believes he is above everything and everyone. Daniel stepped out of the shadows. His presence caused both of them to stop at the same moment. Isabel's gaze met his, and for a moment, everything between them shattered into thin air. There were no more excuses, no more disguises. Just the piercing silence of those caught in the act. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Leonard, on the other hand, maintained his haughty posture, a slight smile on his lips, as if it were no big deal, as if he could control the situation. Daniel stepped forward, slowly, letting the weight of his presence sink over them before finally speaking. "I trusted you." The voice was firm, without tremors, but filled with something Isabel had never heard before. It wasn't just pain. It was something deeper, something that made her stomach turn. She tried to say something, anything that could alleviate what was happening, but Daniel raised his hand, silencing her before she even started. "Now your whole family will discover who you really are." Her eyes widened. The impact of those words hit her like an icy wave. It wasn't just the fear of exposure, it wasn't just the shame of being discovered. It was something more. Something he knew. Something that could destroy not only her reputation, but everything she thought she could still hold on to. Daniel smiled, but it wasn't a smile of satisfaction. It was a cold smile, the smile of someone who had discovered more than was necessary. Isabel felt her heart racing, her hands starting to sweat, and it was at that moment that she realized he knew. Not just about betrayal. He knew what was behind it. Leonard remained still, but a faint sign of discomfort crossed his face. For the first time that night, he felt the control slip through his fingers. Daniel took a step forward, approaching him, lowering his voice to something almost threatening. "Do you really think no one would know? You think I wouldn't investigate? That I wouldn't find the evidence?" The silence between the three became unbearable. Isabel blinked several times, trying to organize her thoughts, but her mind was in chaos. Leonard frowned, his expression becoming tense. Daniel pulled his cell phone out of his pocket and turned the screen toward them. There, a series of emails, bank transfers, exchanges of compromising messages between Leonard and Isabel. But they weren't just messages from lovers. They were messages about something bigger, something that made Isabel feel the ground disappearing beneath her feet. She couldn't breathe. His mind traveled back to the last few weeks, the moments when Leonard assured him that everything was under control, that no one would ever know. But now, there, in front of Daniel, everything was falling apart. "You weren't just sleeping with him, Isabel. You were helping him defraud the company. You were embezzling money, covering up his movements, signing documents that compromised not only him, but you as well." She opened her mouth to deny it, but Daniel slid his finger across the screen, displaying images, document captures, indisputable evidence. Emails that showed she used her position within the company to approve suspicious transactions. All engineered by Leonard, of course, but now she was as sunk as he was. Leonard stepped forward, trying to maintain his composure, but his tone was no longer one of superiority. "You have no idea what you're doing, Daniel. This is not a game." Daniel laughed, a short, bitter laugh. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing. And now, what I'm going to do is expose everything. The entire company will know. Your dear boss's wife will know. Shareholders will know. This here is just the beginning." Isabel felt her legs weaken. She tried to get closer, to touch Daniel's arm, but he backed away, his gaze filled with a contempt she had never seen before. "You destroyed everything, Isabel. All. And why? For what? A man who only used you. Money that will never be worth what you lost today." She wanted to scream. I wanted to deny it. She wanted to say that it wasn't true, that she hadn't done anything wrong. But there were no more arguments. There were no more justifications. All that was left was the sound of falling rain, mixed with the crushing weight of silence. Daniel turned away. He didn't need to hear anything else. They were already doomed. Now, it was just a matter of time. The noise of cars passing quickly on the avenue echoed in the suffocating silence that hovered between the three. Daniel remained still for a few seconds, taking in the scene before him. The glow of the lights reflected on Isabel's wet skin, her eyes fixed on him, desperate to find some crack in that insurmountable barrier that now separated them. Leonard, in turn, crossed his arms, his face rigid, but his restless eyes revealed that for the first time he felt the taste of fear. Daniel turned slowly, ready to leave, ready to completely disengage from this, but Isabel came forward, holding his arm tightly. She called his name, her voice breaking, almost unrecognizable. He stopped, but didn't turn around. He felt her fingers tighten on his sleeve, as if she wanted to hold him in time, to prevent him from leaving, from disappearing. But there was no more room for that touch. He freed himself with a sudden movement, forcing her to let go. "You can't just walk away." Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh, finally turning to face her. "I can't." "And what exactly do you expect me to do, Isabel? For me to stand here and listen to you try to justify all of this? That I forgive you? For me to pretend I haven't seen enough?" She opened her mouth but hesitated, unable to find words. He shook his head, his patience wearing thin. "Tell me, Isabel. Was it the money? Was it the adrenaline of fooling everyone? Was it him?" Leonard took a step forward, but Daniel pointed a finger in his direction without even looking away from Isabel. "If you take one more step, I'll break your face." Leonard froze, but maintained the pose of someone still trying to control the situation. Isabel, on the other hand, could no longer hide the despair in her eyes. "It wasn't like that at all, Daniel. You need to understand." "To understand? What do you want me to understand?" "You betrayed our marriage, our life, what we built together, and on top of that, you got yourself into such big shit that now there's no way to get out without drowning." She brought her hands to her face, pressing her fingers against her forehead, as if trying to find a way to reverse it. "But there was no going back. I didn't want it to be like this." "And how did you want it to be, Isabel?" "That I would never find out. That one day you would simply leave me without an explanation." She looked up, her eyes watery, but there was something there, something beyond guilt, something Daniel couldn't define. "I never thought about leaving you." Daniel laughed again, but this time his voice was filled with bitterness. "But you didn't think twice before destroying everything, did you?" Her silence was more revealing than any response. Leonard adjusted his posture, trying to regain control of his expression. "There's no need to dramatize all of this, Daniel. We can resolve this maturely." Daniel's stomach turned when he heard those words. He moved forward so fast that Leonard took a step back, but Daniel didn't move anymore, just stared at him, so close he could see the sweat gathering on his forehead. "You speak as if you have the right to decide anything here. As if it were just a problem to be managed. Like I'm just an obstacle that needs to be moved out of the way." Leonard narrowed his eyes but stood his ground. "And isn't that exactly what you want? Get out of this situation and move on with your life." Daniel felt raw anger rise in his throat. He swallowed hard, closing his hands into fists, feeling the weight of the moment. "Oh, I'll get on with my life, don't worry. But you two won't get off that easy." He turned around, walking to the car without looking back. Isabel took a hesitant step, but stopped mid-motion, as if she already knew that nothing she said would do any good. As Daniel drove through the wet streets, his mind raced. The memories, the years, everything falling apart in a matter of seconds. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was humiliation. It was the breaking of what he believed to be solid. With each kilometer covered, a plan was forming in his mind. He didn't need cheap revenge, he didn't need screaming or outbursts of anger. What he needed was something definitive. Something that would guarantee that this story wouldn't end as Leonard and Isabel planned. The next day, the bomb exploded. Leonard's wife received an anonymous email. With prints. With proof. With details that left no room for doubt. The company's management received a complete dossier on money embezzlement, illegal signatures and hidden deposits. The scandal didn't take long to spread. Leonard was called to an emergency meeting. He entered the conference room still with a confident posture, but as the accusations began to be read out loud, the blood drained from his face. The directors looked at him with hard looks. The evidence was on the table. There was no escape. He tried to argue, tried to say it was all just a misunderstanding, but then Isabel's name came up in the midst of the accusations. And when she entered the room, pale and visibly scared, the only thing she could do was look at Daniel, who was sitting in the back of the room, arms crossed, watching everything unfold exactly as he had planned. The fall was not quick. But it was definitive. Leonard was fired immediately. Processed. Isabel lost everything within the company. And Daniel? He got up, straightened his jacket and left the room without looking back. There was a new path ahead. And he didn't intend to waste any more time on the past. The chaos that ensued after the revelation was like a fire that no one could put out. The company was in pandemonium. The news about the fraudulent scheme involving Leonard and Isabel spread like a plague, devouring both of their reputations before they had any chance to defend themselves. The hallways were filled with whispers, furtive glances, cutting comments that echoed like sharp knives on the skin of the guilty. Leonard tried to argue, tried to minimize the damage, tried to hold on to whatever thread of control he still thought he had. But the truth was already exposed and, faced with the evidence, his power crumbled. Security was called to escort him out, and he left the building with his head down, aware that his career was over. Isabel, on the other hand, stood there, motionless, feeling the weight of judgment in the eyes of everyone around her. The embarrassment was suffocating. She tried to talk to Daniel, but he didn't even look at her. His presence in that room was enough. He didn't need to say anything else. Her punishment would not come from her words, but rather from the very ruin she brought upon herself. Without Leonard's protection, without the prestige she believed she possessed, she was now alone. The world she clung to was slowly falling apart, and there was no one to hold her back. She tried to claim that she had been manipulated, she tried to justify herself, but no one wanted to hear it. For the board, it was irrelevant whether she had been used or whether she had entered of her own free will. The fact was that his signature was on the documents, that his complicity was undeniable. And now, it didn't matter what he said. Daniel left the building without saying goodbye to anyone. He walked along the busy street without a clear direction, feeling the weight of everything that had happened in the last few days. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt no relief. Just a deep tiredness, an emptiness that couldn't be filled. He had destroyed Leonard and Isabel's lives, but did that really bring any peace? He looked up at the gray sky above, feeling the cold wind cutting into his face, and realized that, for the first time in years, he was truly alone. The house he once called home no longer belonged to him. Upon entering, he found everything the same, but at the same time, nothing seemed the same. The furniture, the photographs still pinned to the walls, the smell of her perfume that still permeated the air. But that wasn't his life anymore. It was just a vestige of the past that he now needed to let go of. He walked to the bedroom, opened the closet and saw her clothes hanging, organized with the same precision as always. She felt an almost uncontrollable urge to rip everything out of there, to erase every trace of her existence within that space. But instead, he just closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The next day, he left without leaving notice. I didn't want to talk, I didn't want any more explanations, I didn't want Isabel to have the chance to try to reverse what was irreversible. He grabbed his bags, took only the essentials and left, leaving behind a failed marriage, a house that no longer had meaning and a story that didn't deserve to be relived. He drove for hours without a defined destination, just following the road, allowing his mind to wander between memories and what would come next. Meanwhile, Isabel sank into increasing despair. She tried to contact Leonard, but he completely ignored her. There was no longer any benefit in maintaining any bond with her. It was discarded as quickly as it was used. The friends who once orbited around him disappeared. The cell phone no longer rang. His family, upon discovering everything, turned their backs on him. The judgment was merciless. She tried to defend herself, tried to find support, but there was no one else. There was nothing left but a pile of regrets and the realization that the life he built on lies had become his own prison. In the following days, loneliness was his only companion. He walked through the empty house, each room feeling like a cruel reminder of what he had lost. I looked at the phone waiting for Daniel to call, waiting for a chance to explain, to ask for forgiveness, to try to repair what was irreparable. But the silence was deafening. Daniel, in turn, found refuge in a small roadside hotel. I spent my days in silence, watching the waves crash on the sand, allowing time to take away my recent pain. But within him, a new restlessness was born. He had closed a cycle, destroyed those who betrayed him, but what would come now? His life had been defined by this revenge for the past few months. Now that it had been completed, only an uncomfortable void remained. He no longer knew who he was without this anger consuming him. But then, one night, something changed. Sitting in the hotel bar, lost in thought, he heard a female voice next to him. Soft, but loaded with an unexpected firmness. A woman who didn't know anything about him, who didn't know his story, but who, with a simple look, was able to see the weight he carried. They talked. About nothing. Above all. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like maybe there was something beyond the pain. Meanwhile, Isabel looked at her reflection in the mirror, realizing that the woman she saw there was no longer the same. What was left of her, after all? What's left of someone who lost everything? He closed his eyes, trying to imagine a future, but all he saw was an immense void in front of him. And, unbeknownst to her, the world around her continued to spin. Without her. Without the importance that one day you thought it had. With no one to save her. The cold night wind cut into Daniel's face as he walked leisurely along the dark sand of the deserted beach. The sound of waves crashing on the shore was the only noise that filled the silence inside him, a silence that seemed to expand more every day. There was something strange about the feeling of finally being free from that invisible prison he had carried for so long. The weight of betrayal, revenge, undone lies, all of that seemed distant now, as if it belonged to another life. But then why did the void still remain? Why, even after everything, did he still feel like something inside him was broken? He stopped, closed his eyes and took a deep breath. There was no rush, there were no more urgencies. He could just continue there, watching the sea and letting time take away what was left of his old life. But time doesn't erase everything. He knew that. The betrayal, the anger, the disappointment, none of it would disappear like the footprints that the tide erased in the sand. He would have to learn to live with that. The sound of footsteps on the sand brought him out of his thoughts. He turned slowly and met the eyes of Sophie, the woman he had met in the hotel bar days before. She knew nothing about him, and perhaps that was what attracted him most to her. There were no expectations, there were no judgments. Just two people who somehow found each other at the right time. She smiled, a light, unassuming smile, as if she felt he needed a little lightness amid the chaos that consumed him. "I thought I'd find you here." Daniel let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Is it that obvious? It's not hard to tell when someone is running away from something." He was silent for a moment, just watching her. There was something reassuring in the way she spoke, as if she didn't need immediate answers, as if she understood that some pains couldn't be explained so easily. "And you? What are you running from?" She looked away at the sea, taking a deep breath before answering. "What everyone runs away from. Of mistakes, of regrets, of wrong choices." He nodded. "I didn't need any more explanations. Everyone carried their own scars, some more visible than others." Sophie sat down on the sand, pulling her knees to her chest, and Daniel did the same. The silence between the two was comfortable, as if it were a safe space where nothing needed to be said. But deep down, something in him knew he needed to move on. And maybe, just maybe, it could be a start. Meanwhile, Isabel was sitting in the small apartment where she now lived, holding her cell phone in her hands, hesitantly. I had already dialed Daniel's number at least 5 times before giving up and deleting it. What would you say? What was left to be said? The headlines about the company's scandal were still circulating in the newspapers, her reputation was destroyed, and she knew that no matter how many times she tried to explain herself, nothing could change what was already done. She got up, walked to the window and looked down at the city below, feeling more alone than ever. I had made many mistakes, but the biggest one was thinking I would never have to pay for them. Now, there was no one by his side. Leonard disappeared completely, the company unceremoniously fired her, and her family cut off contact. The apartment was small, impersonal, completely different from the house she shared with Daniel. And the truth was, no matter how much she tried to deny it, she missed him. Not because she wanted to get back together, because she knew it was impossible, but because he was always the only true thing she had. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to push away the suffocating regret that insisted on growing inside her. He picked up his cell phone once again, hesitated, but finally decided. He typed a short, blunt message. "We can talk." He hit send before he could change his mind. Daniel was sitting on the sand when he felt his cell phone vibrate in his pocket. He picked up the device, looked at the screen and saw Isabel's name. For a moment, he just stared at the message, feeling something stir inside him. He took a deep breath before responding. "Where?" A few minutes later, she sent the address of a discreet cafe, far from the places they usually frequented. The next day, Daniel arrived at the place without knowing exactly what he expected from that conversation. He felt different, further away from everything than he ever imagined he would be. When Isabel arrived, he realized how much she had changed. She was thinner, deep circles under her eyes marked her face, and her gaze carried a weight that wasn't there before. She sat across from him, nervously fidgeting with her coffee cup. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything." Daniel kept his gaze fixed on her, waiting. "But I needed to see you." He continued in silence. "I messed up. I know that. But I never wanted things to end like this." He laughed quietly, shaking his head. "And how did you think it would end, Isabel? Did you really think no one would find out? That this would never have consequences?" She lowered her head, pursing her lips. "I was lost. We all are. But not everyone destroys lives in the process." She swallowed hard, her eyes watering, but she refused to cry there. "Do you hate me?" Daniel let out a long sigh before responding. "No. I just don't care anymore." And that was the worst response she could have received. She nodded slowly, trying to swallow the pain it caused. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Daniel watched her for a few moments before getting up. "I hope you find a way to fix your life, Isabel. But that has nothing to do with me anymore." He placed the coffee money on the table and left, without looking back. She stood there, alone, staring at the empty cup, feeling like this was the final goodbye. And maybe that was what she deserved. Time followed its relentless course, and the dust of events slowly settled. But some wounds never heal completely, some pains become permanent shadows within those who carry them. Daniel had left everything behind, but the past doesn't just disappear, it settles in some corner of the soul, waiting for the right moment to remember it's there. He was no longer the man he once believed himself to be. He was no longer the devoted husband, the exemplary professional, the man who built his life on solid foundations of trust and stability. Now, he was someone who had learned the hard way that everything can fall apart in an instant, that love is no guarantee of loyalty, and that some people simply choose to destroy what should be sacred. But at the same time, he was not a defeated man. He was someone who had survived. The days became months, and Daniel found a new rhythm in his life. He didn't go back to his old job, he didn't want to live in the same city, he didn't want to carry with him the remnants of a past that no longer belonged to him. He chose to start over in a place where no one knew him, where he wasn't the man betrayed, the husband deceived, the executive who exposed a scandal. He just was. And, for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Sophie was still around. Not as a replacement, not as a patch for a broken heart, but as someone who showed up at the right time and knew how to stay. They didn't talk about the past. He didn't want to look back. Meanwhile, Isabel sank deeper every day. The scandal destroyed any chance he had of rebuilding his career. No company wanted to associate its name with someone who was involved in a fraudulent scheme. It didn't matter how much she tried to justify herself, how much she said she was manipulated, that she didn't know the consequences, that everything got out of control. The world didn't want to hear his excuses. The world just moved on without her. The apartment where he now lived was small, suffocating. A cruel irony for someone who spent his life seeking comfort, security, stability. She lost everything, and in the end, she realized she never had anything. He tried to contact old friends, but no one wanted to get involved. He tried to rebuild his relationship with his family, but the contempt in their eyes was enough to understand that it was too late. Daniel? He was the only person who truly loved her, and she destroyed that with her own hands. One night, sitting on the couch, holding a half-empty bottle, Isabel wondered at what moment everything began to fall apart. When exactly have you crossed the line between right and wrong without realizing it? Could it have been in the first look exchanged with Leonard? At the first dinner disguised as a professional appointment? In the first lie told to Daniel? Or was it before that, when he began to desire a different life, without even knowing what that meant? Maybe it has always been like this. Maybe she was never the woman she thought she was. Perhaps, in the end, the betrayal was not a momentary mistake, but rather the inevitable manifestation of who he really was. Leonard, on the other hand, was desperately trying to escape the consequences. He was never the type of man who accepted defeat. He always believed that he could manipulate any situation, that he could overcome any obstacle. But this time, there was no way out. Lawsuits piled up, accounts were blocked, influential contacts disappeared. Without his position of power, he was nothing. His wife abandoned him, taking with her everything she could, including the dignity he never knew how to preserve. He tried, with what little he had left, to start something new somewhere else, but his name was marked. He would never again have the position he once held. What remained was a shadow of the man he pretended to be. Daniel never heard from Isabel or Leonard again after that last meeting. He didn't try to find out, he didn't want to know. Curiosity often tried to drag him into the past, but he refused to give in. Life had taught him the greatest lesson anyone can learn: some stories need to be left behind. And that's exactly what he did. He moved forward, one day at a time, carrying nothing more than what was worth keeping. And so, each one followed their destiny. Some trying to rise from the ruins they created for themselves, others just learning to live without carrying the weight of those who were no longer part of their lives. The past cannot be erased, but it also cannot define what lies ahead. In the end, betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys people, corrodes the soul, strips away everything that is true until only emptiness remains. Some learn, others just fall. Now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Comment your opinion below. I want to know what you would do in Daniel's place. Would you have taken revenge in the same way? Do you believe Isabel deserved a second chance? And Leonard, do you think he got the fate he deserved? I want to see your comment. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications and like for more impactful stories like this. And remember, we do not support any kind of betrayal here. The truth always comes out, and the consequences are inevitable. Until next time.